Good evening. I'm Marvin Pinker, Director of the National Archives Experience, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater. And I'm going to ask you to indulge me for a moment, because tonight is the penultimate time that I will introduce a program from this stage. Next month, I become Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. After more than 7 years of making introductions, I've come to realize that the best part is when I sit down and join you in watching another brilliant evening on this stage. I've been privileged to participate in events with scholars and political leaders, journalists, and even chefs, and with you. Because you, our audience, are our ultimate VIPs. And whether you're a first-time visitor or already a repeat customer, it is for your illumination and interest that our guests on stage, as well as Susan and Tom and Doug and Jeff and all the other folks who work tirelessly behind the scenes, put on these great shows. It's been an honor working for you. Tonight, we head back to our commemorations of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, this evening in combination with the annual celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month. Bringing these two worlds together is my Brandeis classmate, Dr. Jonathan Sarna, and his insightful new when General Grant expelled the Jews. I would like to point out that Dr. Sarna will be available for book signings in the lobby following tonight's program. And I've read the book, you'll want to get it, and want to get it signed. The National Archives has been a participant in Jewish American Heritage Month since its origin in 2006. We recognize that the study of diverse communities whose stories are embedded in our records is an intrinsic part of building a rich understanding of American history as a whole. The National Archives holds the records of Jewish soldiers who fought on both sides of the Civil War, and for that matter, in all of America's historic conflicts from the American Revolution through Vietnam. We also hold research and patents, letters and petitions that document the civic contributions of the American Jewish community and the struggle for full political and religious equality. In marking tonight's event, we have also had the pleasure of a letter from the woman who is most singularly responsible for Jewish American Heritage Month, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So if you will, I've been asked to read this letter to the group. Dear friends, I wish I could be with you this evening as you commemorate Jewish American Heritage Month, a time to celebrate and honor the myriad contributions the Jewish community has made to American history. I'm delighted that the National Archives has once again partnered with the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington to put together this important program. As you know, the American Jewish experience is a story of the immigrant, the labor movement, the battle for civil rights, and much more. Jews in America have blazed trails from the battlefield to the Supreme Court, from the sports field and Symphony Hall to the pages of our nation's history books and our nation's capital. From the time of the colonies until today, Jewish communities have played a significant role in American history and telling the American story. Naturally, that story includes peaks and valleys, triumph and tragedy. Jonathan Sarna's acclaimed new book reveals one of the more difficult times in American Jewish history. When General Grant expelled the Jews gives an account of General Ulysses S. Grant's order to expel all Jews from territory under his command, which fundamentally shaped the Jewish community's involvement in politics in our country. Tonight's discussion with Jonathan and with Steve Roberts should be fascinating illumination of the ways historical events were shaped by and helped form the American Jewish community through the present day. Jewish American Heritage Month provides us a special time for storytelling, teaching our children and our non-Jewish friends and neighbors about the dynamic American Jewish experience. Thank you to the National Archives for your efforts to provide an educational forum for the stories contained in your records, and to the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington for providing community support and expertise. I'm also grateful to the Washington, D.C. JCC, the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, the Jewish War Veterans, the Foundation for Jewish Studies, and the Jewish Community Relations Council for supporting this evening's program. Together, we reflect on the contributions that the Jewish community has made throughout our nation's history. We remain dedicated to forging a better world in the years ahead. I join Congressman Wasserman Schultz in thanking all the partners that she mentioned, but I want to introduce you to a very special co-sponsor. Laura Cohn Applebaum has been Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington and its Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum for the past 18 years. The museum is a steward for the historic 1876 Adas Israel Synagogue on H Street, and under Laura's leadership has played a growing role in preserving and presenting the important role that the Jewish community has played in metropolitan D.C. Laura also played a pivotal role in the 2002 decision to save and restore the 6th and I Street Synagogue, now one of the most vital public program sites in the region. She's the author of 2 books, Jewish Washington and Jewish Life in Mr. Lincoln City, both based on award-winning exhibits. Laura is a former chair of the American Council of Jewish Museums, and most important for tonight's program, she is a member of the National Board of the Jewish American Heritage Month. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my current and future colleague, Laura Applebaum Cohn.
Thank you, Marvin, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with you in your new capacity. I'm really excited about that. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Jewish Historical Society, I want to thank the National Archives for partnering with us again for this special program to commemorate Jewish American Heritage Month, or as we sometimes just say, JAM for short. This is our 2nd year, as Marvin mentioned. Today we're going to learn the story that's at the heart of our work on a daily basis. The story of General Orders Number 11 is inextricably linked to our historic site. As you may know, 14 years after Ulysses S. Grant expelled the Jews as a class from the areas under his control as a Civil War general, he became the first sitting president to attend a synagogue service. This small red brick synagogue, Adas Israel Congregation's first, still stands as the Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum, open to the public for tours, programs, and occasional bar mitzvah, as Marvin's son had in our building about a decade ago. We at the Jewish Historical Society are responsible for the preservation of this special building, a building that has witnessed many changes in our city, and perhaps it's a symbol of the way President Grant changed his perception of the Jewish community, an evolution that Dr. Sarna writes so eloquently about in his new book. The history books that do mention Order Number 11, and there are very few that do, they have a scarce few lines, and I think the majority of Americans are totally unaware of this 19th century episode. Jonathan's book is a wonderful new resource about this complex incident in American history, and it puts the incident and its aftermath in a wider context of its time. I just can't help but comment on the fact that I have such a sense of history, maybe you feel it too, in situ here tonight and also in the book, because we're only a short walk from the historic synagogue that President Grant attended. We're just 2 blocks from where Adolfo Solomon's bookstore stood. This is the place where Caesar Caskell and his delegation from Paducah, Kentucky, arrived to strategize before seeking out President Lincoln in the White House to plead that Grant's orders be rescinded. Jewish leader Simon Wolf lived and worked as a lawyer in the nearby 7th Street neighborhood. You meet all of these personalities on Dr. Sarna's pages. Dr. Jonathan Sarna is a leading expert on American Jewish history. He's the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. He also serves as the chief historian of the new National Museum of American Jewish History on the Mall in Philadelphia. He has written and edited more than 20 books, including American Judaism, which received the Jewish Book Council's Jewish Book of the Year Award in 2004. Accolades for his new book have appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post and New York Times. Stephen Roberts will join Dr. Sarna in conversation tonight. Steve is a best-selling author, a longtime journalist, a political commentator, and the Shapiro, that's the long I, a Washington pronunciation, professor of journalism and political communication at the George Washington University. He has co-authored several books with his wife, Cokie Roberts, including Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions for Interfaith Families, a practical guide for couples based on their experience observing Passover as an interfaith couple. Recent books include a childhood memoir entitled My Father's Houses, and From Every End of This Earth, 13 Families, and the New Lives They Made in America, which examines immigration in America today. These books were both featured at the National Book Festival. Mr. Roberts is a familiar face as a commentator on radio and television, often appearing on Washington Week in Review, CNN, on Hardball. He also substitutes for Diane Rehm on her award-winning radio program. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Sarna and Stephen Roberts to the stage.
Well, what a wonderful crowd. Delighted to be here tonight. And I have two particular reasons in terms of Jewish Washington. As it was mentioned, I hold the Shapiro chair in Washington, and they, of course, are a very distinguished Jewish family right here in Washington, a real estate family, and a very generous and public-spirited family that has donated many chairs at GW and other universities around. So it's part of my link to Jewish Washington. The other link is that around 1920, my grandfather, Avram Rogowski, lived right here in this Jewish neighborhood. That, as Laura said, is only a short walk. He used to tell me the story about living here and how he was a carpenter of some modest accomplishment and could never really get hired because he wasn't a very good carpenter. But he figured out how he would go to the Union Hall here in Washington, and he bought a motorcycle. And he would be the first one to see the jobs being posted at the Union Hall, and to get his motorcycle, he'd get out there first to get the job. After about 2 days, they figured out he wasn't a very good carpenter and they'd fire him. But so I have an affection for the Jewish community here in Washington, where my dad lived as a very young boy for a few years when he was about 4 or 5 years old. So right in this neighborhood. He used to, so it is very much a part of the history. It's very appropriate that we be talking about this subject tonight in this building and in this neighborhood, because it's so much a part of the history of Jews in Washington. And I want to start the conversation, and we will have time, by the way, for questions. There are mics, and you will have to get up, and because, as Susan Clifton said to me, we're the National Archives. We record everything. So you can't just shout out. You got to get up. We look forward to your questions, so we'll leave plenty of time for that. But I want to start, Jonathan, by asking you a rather simple question, which is why you wrote this book. I mean, because after all, this is a very obscure episode.
So, as with many things, there's a kind of long-term interest, and then why I wrote it finally 2 years ago. In 1982, I was a young professor at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and they asked me to give a talk for the Board of Overseers there. It's a very important rite of passage for a new faculty member, and I was determined to prove myself, and that was the 120th anniversary, almost to the day, that lecture of Grant's order. And so I said, well, I would talk about that. New documents had become available from the association that published Grant's papers. So I prepared the lecture and put on my best suit and so on, go out to the board, and everything seems to be going well until I start talking about smuggling. Grant, of course, was deeply concerned about smuggling, and I mentioned that we now know that Grant's own father, Jesse Grant, was involved in a clandestine smuggling ring and an operation with Jewish clothing manufacturers from Cincinnati named Mac. And no sooner were those words out of my mouth than people began shifting uneasily in their seats. And my mentor, the great American Jewish historian Jacob Rader Marcus, went like this. I knew, I had just made some terrible error. And so I hobbled to the end of the lecture, and then there are questions, and a man sitting just about where you are rose to his feet and said, "My name is Mac." That was my great-grandfather that you were talking about. And then he had a long pause, and he said, "And it's all true." So it was a very memorable moment. It was, of course, fascinating. Even then I realized that the family had a tradition, but this was really not known. At that time, the whole story was unknown. Of course, it took me about 30 years to get over that experience. But now for the 150th anniversary of the event, I have been collecting material. And Jonathan Rosen, who is the editor of this really splendid series that Next Book produces, was having a conversation about different things that interested me. And when I said that, he said, "You gotta write it." And so I did. And this is the 150th anniversary of Grant's order this year. And I thought there ought to be a book on that subject. And that's the story.
What was their name before it was Mac?
Mach, Moch, something like that. So these are all German Jews. And
someone whose name was Rogowski changed to Roberts. That's why I asked the question.
Right.
One of the things you mentioned, which was not well known, that I learned from the book, was that there were about 150,000 Jews in America at that time, in 1862. Give us a sense of who they were. Where did they come from? Who was this constituency at this point?
The Jewish community in the United States has grown very rapidly in the middle decades of the 19th century. There were only about 3,000 Jews in 1820, 15,000 Jews in 1840, 150,000 in 1860. Most of those Jews are from Central Europe. They're German-speaking, the lands that would today be Germany and Poland. Those countries were places that oppressed Jews. Many of them had laws that discriminated against Jews. It was easier to come to America, and there was, especially in the wake of revolutions in Germany and economic change, lots of immigrants, lots of non-Jewish immigrants, of course, are coming from that area to America, and Jews came probably numbers about 15 times the rate of non-Jews, which reminds you that they had reasons of their own for wanting to come. They're spread out across the country, but what's important is most of them are new immigrants, meaning they had accents, they probably looked a little different, and that's why I think it was easy for Americans, and certainly for men like General Grant, to lump them all together, Jews as a class.
Which is a phrase from General Order 11.
Exactly. And to believe that they were a group and engaged in smuggling, which was really what troubled him, and we should move them out of his territory.
Now, when you talk about the order, it's been mentioned several times, but a lot of you probably don't even know exactly what it said. And so why don't you tell us exactly what it said? I mean, you used the phrase as a class. That was the catchphrase that people fastened on and that was particularly upsetting to people.
Right. So there are, of course, quite a few copies here in this very building, but it reads, the Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. And then it goes on, warning that anybody who's caught will be imprisoned and no passes will be given to these people to visit headquarters for the purpose of making personal application for trade permits. So a very explicit order that refers indeed to Jews as a class, which was a phrase that was remembered for a long time.
Now, there's a map in the book which shows you exactly what part of the country this applied to. It was called the Tennessee Department that General Grant in 1862 was the commander of. And it basically starts around Paducah, Kentucky, and goes south through Tennessee and then through Mississippi. And Grant's headquarters were actually in Mississippi at the time, Holly Springs, Mississippi. But it's that part of the country. It's sort of the south central part of the country that this order applied to.
Between the Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers.
And what was your best feeling about what motivated Grant? It's been mentioned his father was involved. What led to this rather harsh language?
So, as in many things, I think there's a cause and then there's an occasion the moment it happens. If one reads Grant's papers, it's clear that he's been worried for months about smuggling. To his mind, if he could do something about the smugglers, the South would be starved into submission.
So there was a military reason behind this.
And he and Sherman are absolutely persuaded that these smugglers are traitors and they are making it possible for the South to continue fighting because they're allowing the cotton to be sold. And of course, people were smuggling stuff into the South and smuggling the cotton
But it was
out.
primarily cotton being smuggled out to these clothing manufacturers in the North.
Right, and then you're smuggling in quinine and prepared foods, and even clothing has to be smuggled into the South. After all, the two sections of the country were interdependent. Of course, from the point of view of smugglers, this was fabulous. You could make a fortune smuggling stuff into the South, and an even bigger fortune, like 400%, smuggling cotton out. Cotton was like oil, and everybody needed it. The South had it, and you could make a lot of money. So we know lots of people were smuggling, but there's no question that Grant's troops and others caught Jews smuggling. No doubt that Jews were among those who smuggled. They also tended to have family both sides of the border. Many of them had a lot of experience in trade, but because they had caught some Jews smuggling, Grant, and it was certainly not Grant alone, concluded some Jews were smuggling, all Jews were smugglers. And that was, of course, the Jews as a class. Now, why it happens on December the 17th, that's connected with Jesse Grant and the coming to Grant's headquarters. And, of course, Ulysses explodes. We have two witnesses that said when he realized his own father is engaged in smuggling and with a Jew. He sends the Max packing and sits down and in high dudgeon writes off this order. John Y. Simon, who Laura mentioned and whom I wish I had known, but who did write on this subject, suggested that in a sense, instead of expelling his father, Grant expelled the Jews. Classic displacement.
But one of the interesting things about the order, because you read it, it is so sweeping, questions were raised. For instance, did this include Jewish soldiers who served under Grant's command, who were in this territory? And there was this group of merchants called sutlers who were suppliers to the army and that they couldn't do without. So immediately there were questions raised about who really is affected by this.
Right, and one of the fascinating questions that I had in writing the book was, Grant issues this sweeping order. There were several thousand Jews in his territory. Memphis was one of the largest Jewish communities in the South. And yet, I couldn't even find 100 Jews who had been expelled. Now, there certainly were some and manhandled and so on, but he issued the order. Why weren't they all expelled? And it actually took a fair time before I was reading what's called the official record of the War of the Rebellion. You can figure out which side wrote the official record from the title. And there are many books. They're now all online. It was one of the great pieces of official history at the end of the 19th century. And in reading it, I realized that Grant's forces were attacked just with less than 72 hours after he issues that order. And there's a long description. Grant was not at the scene, and the officer in charge, they use a euphemism that he was out at some entertainment which made him a trifle overbold, which was really a way of saying he was stone drunk. And we have this description, and therefore it's a horrendous raid on Grant's headquarters. And there's a long description, all the 2,000 captured and rations burned and so on and so forth. And then it says the telegraph lines were cut for miles around by the Confederate raiders. And that, of course, was the key to the mystery. Because the telegraph lines were cut, word of the order spread slowly. All of those people who were sending telegrams to Grant, did you really mean that our Jewish soldiers have to be sent out? And how can we live without the settlers? I mean, armies move on their stomach. So none of those telegrams got through to Grant, and a lot of people did nothing, which was very beneficial for the Jews. And of course, we know that the telegraph lines were down because it takes 12 days just until the order arrives in Paducah, which isn't so very far away. And that's really when the Jewish community gets aroused and learns about the order and gets excited, is when it gets to Paducah. And in Paducah, there is a lieutenant who starts evicting all of that city's Jews.
Now, Paducah is not necessarily thought of as a center of Jewish life or commerce, but it
has a synagogue to this day.
But it plays a critical role, and primarily because of the work of his name has already been mentioned in the introduction, Caesar Cascal, who is one of the great heroes in your book. And tell us what he did and how the role he played here.
It's really fascinating. There was supposed to be a descendant of Caesar Cascal, and if you're here, identify yourself.
He right there. There he is.
Oh, okay. Wow. Welcome. Indeed, this is an example of. There's a Talmudic statement about how you can earn your place in the world to come in a moment. We never would have heard of Caesar Cascal, I think, but for this incident. He is told, he's one of the 30 Jewish families told they have to get out of Paducah within 24 hours. He had come there. He had a business. He was a staunch Union supporter. Indeed, his brother had actually recruited soldiers. So he's extremely angry. And
Kentucky had sort of declared neutrality in the war. So
but Kentucky declared itself neutral, but of course Grant had captured and occupied Paducah. Paducah was a hotbed of smuggling, and the city was itself divided between Confederates and Unionists, and everybody blamed the other, but they all agreed that the Jews were responsible for most of the problems. And they expel Cascal. And first thing he does is he sends a long telegram to Abraham Lincoln. He's come to America. He's a fairly recent immigrant. He's going to go right to the top. He telegraphs Abraham Lincoln. And then he was a merchant. He knew something about public relations. And everywhere he goes, the boat takes him to Cincinnati. So he's in touch with news correspondents. Indeed, you would have loved him. He gives out a news release. And it's really because of Haskell that most people learn about the order.
And the Associated Press picks it up.
Exactly. The AP picks it up. It goes right across the country. That's how people learn about it. And then this guy, nothing daunted, he appoints himself to go down to Washington carrying the order, and he's going to go straight to the President of the United States. It's a free country, so he's going to go and do it. And he gets to Washington very quickly, and he gets there on a Saturday night, and he goes straight to Congressman from Cincinnati, Republican congressman who was friendly with Lincoln, shows him, I guess, the order. Maybe they strategized a bit, and anyway, they go over. Lincoln, who turns out to be as good as you want him to be in this setting, he says he's always glad to see his friends, and then in they go, and of course Lincoln doesn't know anything about this order. The telegraph lines are down. They can't believe. It's clear that they have trouble believing such an order has even been issued. But we do have later this this amazing dialogue. Of course, it's written years later, and the historian in me wonders maybe the dialogue is a little bit too good to be true.
Right.
But it's fabulous dialogue that is preserved between Lincoln and Caesar Haskell, where
It's good enough for us journalists, not for you historians.
Right.
Yeah.
And indeed, the man who preserved it was a journalist.
Of course.
Lincoln, according to this account, says, and so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. And Haskell...
That was Paducah, the happy land of Canaan. You can see there was a bit of embellishment here. Right.
And Haskell cleverly replies, yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection. And Lincoln says, and this protection they shall have at once. Whether, even if it didn't exactly happen that way, we certainly know that Lincoln instantly commands Henry Halleck, who was then the general-in-chief of the Army, to countermand General Orders Number 11, and they send a fascinatingly worded telegram to Grant that reads, if such an order has been written, it will be immediately revoked. And that use of the subjunctive suggests that they didn't really believe it, but of course it was true. We have many copies now, and Grant complies instantly, and and Caesar Haskell is able to return home to Paducah, and supposedly when they asked him, he got there so quickly, by whose order he was returning home, and he said by order of the President of the United States, and so on. So the important thing in the story immediately is, yes, such an order is issued, reminding us of the worst of European expulsions, but the order is countermanded in record time. December 28th, and by January the 4th, it's countermanded. I'm not sure Washington could move that quickly today.
It hasn't moved that quickly since then. That's the record right there. But, the other figure Haskell's a great figure. By the way, what is your relationship to Haskell?
Granduncle.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. The other figure who... great-granduncle. The other figure who did play a role was the much more famous Isaac Mayer Wise, Rabbi Wise, who was in Cincinnati, a critical city in this, and explain his role as well.
So Isaac Mayer Wise, who great Reform rabbi, and also the editor of a very significant Jewish newspaper, he does a great deal to publicize this event and to ensure that Jews hear about it, and he actually throughout the war, his newspaper published a great deal of Jewish news, North and South. Cincinnati is exactly the right place for information to flow into. But he's also writing off letters, which we have, to public officials, writes to Stanton and so on, can't you do something? And then he also, with other Jewish leaders, rushes down to Washington. Of course, Lincoln's already acted, and all these rabbis are going down to Washington, and they reach Philadelphia, and there they read in the newspaper that the order has been countermanded. So the question is, what should they do? Well, being rabbis, they're not going to lose an opportunity. So they, of course, continue. But now they say, great, we'll go and thank the president. And that is exactly what they do. They go to Washington. They, too, meet with Abraham Lincoln. They thank him. And there we have a contemporary account. So I do trust it. It's actually by Isaac Mayer Wise, who had not been a great fan of Abraham Lincoln's before then. And Wise tells us that Lincoln told the group, meaning the rabbis, to condemn a class is, to say the least, to wrong the good with the bad. I do not like to hear a class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners. I mean, that quote, one might still feel today, is worthy of being remembered. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, one of the things that you write about in the book was that even though the order was rescinded quickly, it had a lasting impact in the sense that it reminded this immigrant community of their somewhat tenuous position. And even though, as you say, it was both the worst and the best, what do you think the importance of it was? What was the lasting impact on the Jewish community and on the country?
So it has a remarkable impact. First of all, I mean, from the point of view of the Jewish community in 1862, here they have fought Ulysses S. Grant, and they've won. They've had the order countermanded. That's tremendously empowering for an immigrant community. It's actually the second time in a 2-year period that the Jewish community had fought for something. Earlier, they had fought for the Jewish chaplaincy. That is to say, the original chaplaincy law restricted the chaplaincy to ministers of some Christian denomination. Jews felt excluded. There are 10,000 Jewish troops, and Jews battled to have that law changed. And with Abraham Lincoln's aid, they do change it, and we have the first Jewish chaplain. So they'd won once. Of course, this was a much more serious issue. And again, the Jewish community, in a sense, has won. So they're empowered. They wanted Grant to be censured, and that does not happen. Grant has friends in Congress, and after all, the order has been rescinded, and Grant is protected. And of course, once he wins in Vicksburg and then other places, he becomes a great hero. And you'd think that the order would be forgotten. And indeed, there's almost nothing said about the order between 1863 and 1868. But in 1868, Grant runs for president. And then, as now, when you run for president, the other party looks to find out what dirt can they use. And, Grant was a national hero. This was tough. And then they find this order. And this to them
They found it on YouTube?
It must have been, yeah. This was fabulous. And so suddenly this order becomes central in the 1868 campaign. It's really the first time that a Jewish issue has been front and center in a presidential campaign. I actually had, in researching the book, the good fortune to come upon a handbook that was given to Democratic stump speakers in the 1868 election. After all, they didn't have radio and television, so they sent people, in different places to give speeches. And I was astonished at how much they said about General Order Number 11, and they even gave them hints as how they should talk about it.
And what was it that they pushed on, and what was the argument that they made to try to discredit Grant?
Well, that clearly a man who had so persecuted Jews as a class wasn't fit to be president of the United States, some of them said, well, everybody was doing it. Why did he single out Jews? And in a sense, this was, and Grant himself knew it, this was the great stain on his record. And they went to town with it. Most Americans hadn't heard about it, I think, in 1862. After all, the Emancipation Proclamation kind of pushed, in January the 1st, pushed this issue off the front page. But in 1868, all sorts of people heard about it. And I was amazed at how many newspapers in obscure places were talking about this issue. Clearly the non-Jews.
And one of the interesting things about that campaign, and you to some extent relate it to contemporary politics, that here you had most Jews tended to be Republican and side with Lincoln's policies of emancipation, and yet it was the Democrats who took up in that election the cause of the Jews, and that created some real conflict and tension within the Jewish community and Jewish voters.
Right. It's really the first time that we see Jews debating among themselves. Who should we vote for? And our American interests for liberal Jews was to support the Republicans. They were the party of Reconstruction. They advocated liberal policies. The Democrats wanted to deny black Americans the right to vote and really wanted to roll back Reconstruction-era policies. On the other hand, how could you vote for a man who had expelled Jews as a class from his war zone? So Jews faced the problem, should we vote for a party, the Democrats, who they thought would be bad for the country, just to avoid voting for a man, Ulysses S. Grant, who had been bad to the Jews? And you have this fascinating debate that is carried out in public. That's good for a historian that it's carried out in public, because I could find the debate on how Jews should vote and what's appropriate. And should Jews vote as Americans, or should they vote as Jews? And could you separate when you voted as a Jew and Jewish interest from voting as an American interest? And it's really a fascinating debate.
Sure. Now, of course, we didn't have exit polls, so we don't know how they actually voted. Do you have any sense of how they actually voted?
Well, I once really, it's funny how it's something you find as a graduate student can later turn out to be valuable. When I was at Yale, they had just gotten in a diary of a young man named Louis Eric, who was actually one of the first Jewish students at Yale. And I read it because I was interested then. And Louis Eric is there debating in his mind, how do I vote in this election? And he keeps this diary, and in the end he says, I couldn't bring myself to vote for a man who had so dishonored the Jewish people. So I knew how he voted, and we actually know that a man who later becomes quite significant in the Grant administration, he's sent off as consul to Romania, and very important Jewish figure named Benjamin Franklin Peixoto, similarly, from a very famous Sephardic family, similarly voted Democratic, even though he was a liberal, against Grant. Others, however, voted for Grant. Simon Wolfe, who was mentioned, becomes one of Grant's great supporters and apologists, and really has come to respect Grant and runs around the country trying to persuade Jews that Grant wasn't responsible and they should vote for him. He even named one of his children for Ulysses S. Grant, so persuaded was he. Adolf Ulysses Grant Wolfe, the boy's name was. But in any case, my guess is that the Jewish vote was divided. In the 19th century, the Jewish vote was generally divided. It's only in the 20th century, beginning in 1928, that we begin to sense that the vast majority of Jews vote for one party. Nobody in the 19th century had such a notion.
And of course, you mentioned that Grant himself was very well aware that this was a stain, the word you used, on his record. And one of the interesting themes of the book is that you also use the word atone, that a very Jewish word, that he atoned for this stain, this misjudgment, this mistake, in all sorts of ways, including, you mentioned coming to the ceremony at Addis, Israel, and sitting for 3 hours. I mean, talk about atoning. I mean, he had a lot to atone for, but 3 hours.
That's not just atonement, that's penance.
That's penance, that's right. But also and I found this fascinating that in addition to Peixoto, that there are a number of Jews who he appointed to important cabinet posts, and talk about some of those figures.
So Grant, first of all, as soon as he's elected, he didn't want anybody to think he's pandering to the Jewish vote, but as soon as he's elected, he actually pens a letter of apology that tells Jews pretty much what they had wanted to hear from the president, and he says, "I do not sustain that order." And Jews take it as an apology. But it's not just an oral apology. One of his first appointments is Simon Wolf, whom he appoints, and Simon Wolf becomes his Jewish advisor. And we know that Simon Wolf recommends various people who he then appoints to public office. One is governor of the territory of Washington, and another is appointed to a significant position in Indian affairs, which is fascinating because that was otherwise a Christian preserve, and there's a story about it. And he wanted, as you say, to appoint the first Jewish cabinet member. He invites the great banker Joseph Seligman to be a secretary of the Treasury. Seligman turns it down, and he also, you mentioned Adolphus Solomons, and the tradition is that he invited Adolphus Solomons to be equivalent of mayor, it was called governor then, of Washington, D.C. Adolphus Solomons, however, was Sabbath observant, and he felt that the head of Washington, D.C. couldn't be a Sabbath observant Jew. And so, at least according to the tradition, which is brought by son-in-law, that's why he turned it down. And Grant appointed a variety of other Jews, ambassadors and postmen and so on, but he went out of his way to appoint Jews. And in addition, his foreign policy is remarkable. America, prior to the Civil War, had been very reluctant to call out other countries on issues of human rights. President Buchanan, for example, was asked, couldn't you say something at the time of what was known as the Mortara affair? A Jewish boy is accidentally converted as a child by his nursemaid and is removed from his parents because a Catholic child can't be brought up by Jewish parents, and is brought into the Vatican. And there was outrage in the country, and they asked Buchanan, won't he speak up? And Buchanan knows he can't speak up because, after all, children were taken from their parents all the time in the slave South, and he knew it would be rank hypocrisy, and that's why he can't do it. But now, after the Civil War, that's behind us. And so when Russia wants to expel Jews from an area then known as Bessarabia, Kishinev is in Bessarabia. They want to expel them, and they say, amazingly, they say the Jews are smuggling. We want to expel them. Now, I'm sure that, had it happened today, all the advisors would tell the president, you don't want to touch this because everyone will remember General Order number 11. You should have nothing to do with this at all.
To say nothing of the power of the Bessarabian vote.
But Grant actually speaks up vigorously against that expulsion, whether or not the Jews were not expelled, whether it's for that reason or other reasons, historians dispute. And then when Jews are persecuted in Romania, Grant does an unprecedented thing. He actually appoints a Jewish consul, this Benjamin Franklin Peixoto, to Romania with the full understanding that he is going to go and largely be involved in helping the Jewish community, which indeed is what he does. And he gives him an astonishing letter. This is probably, I couldn't prove it was the first, so I didn't say it, but probably the first such expression of human rights. And we're still debating now, think of Syria, the extent to which America should be concerned about the internal affairs of other countries. Listen to Grant. Mr. Peixoto has undertaken the duties of his present office more as a missionary work for the benefit of the people who are laboring under severe oppression than for any benefits to accrue to himself, a work which all good citizens will wish him the greatest success in. He then continues. The United States, knowing no distinction of her own citizens on account of religion or nativity, naturally believe in a civilization the world over which will secure the same universal liberal views. U.S. Grant. An astonishing private letter. By the way, he didn't check with his Secretary of State when he wrote that letter. The Secretary of State was very angry. And maybe for that reason, that letter is not in this building. It actually is in the American Jewish Historical Society. But it is a remarkable state letter. And indeed, we know that from documents here that Peixoto deeply concerns himself with persecuted Jews. I spoke in the New York Historical Society a few days ago, and at the lecture, a Jew from Romania came up and said that he was brought up with the name Ulysses S. Grant as someone who had been wonderful to the Jewish community, that he didn't know anything about what I wrote here. All he knew is Grant was a hero for the Jews of Romania. I was fascinated that that tradition was kept alive, at least in his community, really until the present day.
We want to go to questions. And while people are coming, I'm going to ask a final question here, and then we'll get to the audience. You've talked about how the issuing of the order represented a dark side of America, an anti-immigrant suspicion of foreigners, and that the rescinding of it also represented a benign strain in America. And in my own work, I've noticed over and over again in American history, this is very typical. That America is profoundly ambivalent about immigrants. We celebrate immigrants, and yet in 1750, Benjamin Franklin preached against the Germans who were going to despoil the American character. Just a few years before General Order 11, the Know Nothing Party had a major impact on American politics by being anti-Catholic, mainly against Irish and German Catholics. So talk about how this order fits in your sense as a historian in the larger American story of oscillation back and forth between welcoming and yet condemning immigrants.
I think what is amazing in American history really is the group after group, including the Germans and the Catholics.
To say nothing of the Japanese.
Well, I was going to get to the Japanese. It's 20th century. They have memories of being persecuted in America. In a sense, America is a great country. We're very pluralistic in our persecutions. And Almost every group has some memory of a period when they were persecuted, but then has the good fortune of seeing themselves celebrated. And, clearly the archetype is Black Americans, but the same story, it would be true from the Irish, the Germans, the Japanese,
the Italians, very much.
The Italians and the Muslims. I mean, it's always the same story. They all look back at a certain moment, and then later they are integrated, and we are astonished that once upon a time people persecuted, when today they're such good citizens and their descendants are shapers of America, maybe even presidents of the United States.
Right, a very American story.
Yep.
Yes, sir, please start.
Appreciate your presentation.
Should we ask people to identify themselves or not? Don't have to. Okay, please
All
go
right.
ahead.
Could you take us back to General's headquarters again in Mississippi and sort of walk us through the scenario? Who actually drafted the order? I mean, was it something that was like put in front of him? Or, I mean, was this done by, obviously they all have adjutants.
Right.
And walk, who's the one, whose idea was this and how did it get up the chain of command?
Well, you're absolutely right that in 1868, when Grant runs for office, so some of his defenders say, he had nothing to do with it. Some underling sent the order. It was all pre-printed and so on. Now that we have Grant's papers, it's absolutely impossible to maintain that fiction. And that's all thanks to John Y. Simon. First of all, one can see that there's been concern that Grant has expressed and Sherman expresses about these Jewish smugglers. Indeed, the word Jew and the word smuggler were used interchangeably, just like Yankee and Northerner are interchangeable, Jew and smuggler. And we can see concern for months, really, as early as July of 1862, you can see concern expressed. And then you can see that just 8 days before the order, a man named John Van Dusen Du Bois, in a much more limited area, has expelled Jews and a few other groups from a more limited area, and Grant overturns that order, and indeed Du Bois gets into a lot of trouble. And then just 8 days later, Grant himself issues this order, and of course I argue that is because of the experience with his father. Now, whether Grant, apparently, when one reads biographies of Grant, Grant could rattle off these orders. He was very, very good at dictating them. Rawlins, who is his adjutant, is certainly the person who sends them out. And actually, there are slight differences in wording. There are at least 4 different texts. But I don't have any doubt that the order came from Grant. And indeed, Grant never denied that the order came from him. Now, he does, and I'll say one other thing since you asked about it. There's no mention of this in Grant's memoirs. The fabulous memoirs, probably the best memoirs of any American general of Grant's. And he does pass over, he doesn't talk about his drunkenness, and he doesn't talk about this. His son, Frederick, who worked with Grant, tells us that he asked his father, shouldn't we talk about this episode? And Grant replied, best not referred to. The less said, the better. But there's also a memoir published by John Y. Simon, who found, I think it's by him, published, it's only published in 1975 by Grant's wife, Julia Dent. And, it even happens today, what husbands like to forget, their wives like to remember. And she calls the order obnoxious. That's her word. If Grant had not issued the order, if it had been somebody else, his wife wouldn't have called it an obnoxious order and gotten. She goes on, it should never have been issued against any class, and he felt badly about it, and so on. So she knew that he took responsibility, and I therefore do believe that it was Grant's doing.
Good. Yes, sir. You next.
Two questions. Did the order cover New Orleans, where, after all, most of the Jewish cotton traders were? If not, did Benjamin Butler, a very tough general who regarded any pro-Southern woman as a prostitute, did he try to crack down on the Jews? Question number two, proportionally, did more Jews fight for the Confederacy or the Union?
Okay, so two good questions. New Orleans is not under the Department of the Tennessee. I have a map, and you can see that it doesn't go in as far as New Orleans, and that's because Butler, of course, is in New Orleans. Butler had nothing good to say about Jews. By the way, Butler himself was engaged in a good deal of smuggling. They didn't, and so I think they called him not just beast but spoons, because spoons would disappear, especially if they were silver. And he became quite wealthy after the Civil War. The particular issue of we'll leave aside of that episode with a Jewish woman, I have to say, had she not been a woman, but being a man, he would have shot her, and maybe she deserved it, and to laugh at a funeral of a Union soldier publicly. I think even today, in an occupied area, that kind of mockery wouldn't be tolerated. So I am less sympathetic, but it's for another day. I'm less sympathetic than some for Butler's actions, but in any case, it wasn't in Grant's territory. Now, most of the soldiers in the Civil War were actually on the north of if there were 10,000, most of them were in the north, and probably only 2,500, but maybe you'll know the exact numbers now. You're asking as a percentage of the population whether the South produced more than the North, and I don't know the answer to that. It's possible. The Southern Jews certainly remembered the Jewish soldiers better, and there is to this day a Confederate Jewish cemetery, one of the rare Jewish military cemeteries, and it's there in the South, and of course there's no equivalent
And of course,
in the North. I should say, I don't know if you want to answer it, Robert Marcus, who is with us.
Well, it's in Richmond, a beautiful cemetery.
Who knows much more about individual Jews. Is Bob still here? Oh, there. Do you want to, maybe you have to go to the microphone, Bob, if you want to talk about it. Bob is real. Those of you who've seen the film, which I recommend, Jewish Soldiers in Blue and Gray, Bob was central in that, and nobody knows more about the individual soldiers than Bob. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I believe a higher percentage of Jews fought for the Confederacy for several reasons. I believe there was a higher percentage of native-born Jews living in the territory of the Confederacy. Roughly 3,000 Jews fought for the Confederacy, and they occupied approximately 25% of the Jewish population in America at the time.
and of course there was the role of Judah Benjamin, who a prominent Jew who was Secretary of War in the Confederate cabinet.
Right. He's Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of the State. There is a marvelous statement by Senator Ben Wade, who called Judah Benjamin an Israelite with Egyptian principles.
This gentleman in the red shirt, go ahead, please.
I'm just sort of struck by the fact that in 1868, this order was issued. It resonated with the population. I mean, I assume it wasn't because of great sympathy for the Jews. I'm just wondering why it was it just because it was something that seemed wrong?
Yeah, I think that by 1868, the idea that you would single out Jews as a class and expel them, there were enough immigrants in different groups, just as we are appalled. We can't understand how Japanese could have been put in detention camps. It's unimaginable. And I think by 1868, they thought about the expulsion of Jews as a class the same way. That's certainly my sense.
And would you say that there was a connection between the triumph of the North and the abolitionist sentiment? I mean, the country had just fought a war to liberate a repressed minority.
I mean, there were Democrats who, I think, wanted to undo Reconstruction. First of all, they didn't want to keep troops in the South, and many of them were not sympathetic to African Americans. They may have opposed slavery, they may have opposed the South, but to read Democratic rhetoric from the 1868 election is really, from their perspective, quite appalling. Indeed, I reprint a Thomas Nast cartoon where, these Democrats are basically standing on the neck of an African American, and that's what he properly understood was what they wanted. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Jonathan. I have two questions. A few years ago, I think McFeely was the writer who won a Pulitzer for biography of Grant. He once gave a talk in Washington, I think maybe here, and I asked him the question about 11. Mm-hmm. And he said something that was very strange to me. He said, to most people who are not Jews, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. It didn't matter much to most people, and I was taken aback at that time. Did you discover that in your research, that it wasn't a big deal to Americans at that time?
I would say that in 1862, it was not a big deal. It was a big deal to Jews, not a big deal to Americans. After all, there were all sorts of human rights violations in the Civil War. I list some here, and it's not pretty. In a sense, if you think that some of the recent revelations about what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq are aberrations, you read what went on in the Civil War, and there are any number, and Professor Neely has written a couple of books on that subject. So in 1862, it's not a big issue, but in 1868, it becomes a big issue. I would say that Professor McFeely, it's a wonderful book, but he has not taken advantage of the new look at Grant. He is quite negative on Grant. It's really a newer group of historians who have had the benefit of the letters that John Y. Simon published, and many of them had the experience I had myself reading. I became very deeply impressed with this man, and that has really led to a total reappraisal of Grant, who, after all, when he died, most people thought that you had Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. And it's only and that's why they built Grant's tomb. Look at it. You didn't build that for a man who was despised. It's only in the 20th century that his reputation declines drastically. It sinks like a stone. And largely that is on account of historians, some of them students of Professor Dunning in Columbia, who thought that his policies, liberal policies on towards African Americans, were totally misguided and were deeply angered by Reconstruction, and they tarnished Grant's reputation. And now, in a post-civil rights America, where an African American is president of the United States, there is a kind of look back and a sense, wow, Grant was really ahead of his time. And some of the books say, and he was really much better, except for the Jews, and there he made a terrible mistake. And now I hope that my book shows that even in terms of the Jews, yes, he made a terrible mistake, but he certainly did everything he could in the last 2 decades of his life to rectify and undo that mistake, and the Jewish community not only forgave him, when he died, they mourned him in every synagogue.
Yeah. And the second question has to do with a large political issue. In 1862, Lincoln and his cabinet and everybody were very much afraid of England getting involved. Okay, so now you have Disraeli, you have Rothschilds there. Something like this, Lincoln might have said, you know, this could turn, and you had a lot of people in England who were in the cotton industry who were supporting the South. This might flip them towards supporting the South. Do you think that happened?
It's a very interesting idea, but I did not find anybody who, said anything of the kind, and I tend to think that Grant was not deeply interested in that issue. Lincoln was deeply interested in preventing England from entering the war, and that's why Lincoln was prepared to allow a certain amount of cotton to move from the South back to England, because he understood the politics of scarce commodities and understood that if you didn't let cotton go, they might indeed intervene on the side of England. In many ways, cotton then was like oil today, and deprivation of oil might lead people to intervene on the side of the folks who have that resource. And that's what Lincoln wanted to prevent. Grant and Sherman had no patience for the argument. They said you can't trade with the people and fight against the people at the same time. Their idea was, let's starve the South out, prevent everything, and then we'll defeat the South and we'll send all the cotton later. But in any case, although your suggestion is interesting, I have never found a reference to anybody making the suggestion that you did. But if you ever find such evidence, I'd love to see it.
I think we have one more, sir.
And here it is.
Please go ahead.
There was another strategic material that Lincoln was very much concerned about that rivaled cotton, and this came to a head after the Trent affair, and that was nitrates, and that nitrates were used in explosives, and the world's market was under England's control because it came from India. So that's why Lincoln was so concerned that, fortunately, DuPont in this country had secured a supply of nitrates before that came to a head. But that was not what I wanted to ask.
Okay. Can I make just one comment, and that is that Michael Oren argues, today he's the ambassador to Israel, of course he's an important historian. Michael Oren argues that the growing of cotton in Egypt, although some had started earlier, the growing of cotton was really meant to ensure that all cotton wouldn't come from the South, that never again would Europe be deprived of cotton if there were a war in the United States. So just as the oil boycott led to new sources of oil and independence, so he says the Civil War led to the opening up of and the search for new places where cotton would grow, and the cotton industry in Egypt, which has been very important later on, all has its roots in the American Civil War. Anyway, your other question. Yeah.
Okay. There was concern about whether the motivation for Order 11 came from the bottom up, but there was no thought about whether it came from the top down. Now, I'm not implying that Lincoln had anything to do with it, but something that I don't think has been emphasized adequately is that Grant was not without enemies, and one of his greatest enemies was none other than General-in-Chief Halleck himself. And Halleck was quite concerned. He recognized Grant as a real rival. So anything he could do to weaken Grant's pen, he did. And then when it came to tossing a little dirt around, he was not against that in order to slow Grant's rise through the ranks.
So indeed, for a long time, and I talk about it here, the claim was made that somebody else instructed Grant to make that order. At one point, Grant's own father, Jesse, said, "Oh, my son was required to do it." And Isaac Mayer Wise accepted this idea for a while. The problem is, first of all, we have a very complete set of telegrams and messages sent out here in Washington, in this very building, and nobody, and they've searched, nobody has ever found such a message sent to Grant implying that he should take care of the Jews and expel them. And indeed, there only were a very few people who were sending out and receiving telegrams. And some of them later said if a telegram had been issued, there only were a small number of people, Halleck was one of them, who could issue orders to Grant, they would have known about it. They would have been the people sending the telegram, and they insisted no such telegram was sent. So even though you're absolutely correct about earlier accounts, say that, I don't agree.
Okay, we have time for
One more.
one more. Go ahead,
All right.
please, ma'am.
I was wondering, what were people's reaction to Grant appointing Jews into public positions while he himself was in office?
Good. And I indeed talk a lot about that. In several cases, there was opposition, none more important than when he made this appointment to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because after all, the whole idea which Grant supported was to Christianize the Indians. That was our official. It's a fascinating aspect of American history, notwithstanding church-state separation. Indian affairs were almost entirely in the hands of church leaders, and the policy which Grant endorsed was basically to Christianize the Indians. So how do you appoint a Jew? There is no question that he was appointed because he was a Jew. Simon Wolfe went to Grant. Can we not have a Jew? And there was tremendous opposition, and I quote quite a lot of it here, to having a Jew in that position. They made his life a misery. Today, he's remembered as the first Jew who went to Arizona, but they made his life a misery.
But not the last.
Not the last, right? And his name was Herman Bendel, and there was later a meeting of the Board of Indian Commissioners in which they said, Bendel was a doctor, and he gives us reports of it. He said, Dr. Herman Bendel, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Arizona, is a most excellent official, a man of splendid judgment, strict integrity, who has managed the affairs to entire satisfaction, but unfortunately, he is not a Christian. Anyway, Bendel solved the problem because he decided to get married, and his bride didn't want to live as the only Jew in Arizona, and so he resigned. But there certainly were people who were quite unhappy about it.
Thank you.
Herman Bendel, by the way, changed his name to Henri Bendel. I want to thank, this has been a great audience. Dr. Sarna, a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for proving once again the archives is a great place.